After that day, I said nothing. And that wasn't by chance, it was a choice. I didn't back down, I didn't call anyone, I didn't tell the truth to my family. But I didn't lie either. I simply remained silent. And that silence created something strange between us. It wasn't a spoken agreement. There was no conversation, no confirmation. It was an invisible agreement. I didn't expose it. She didn't insist. At first glance, it seemed the situation had stabilized, but anyone who has experienced something like this knows, when nothing is resolved, nothing is at peace. I continued my routine normally: work, commitments, small daily conversations. But there was a fundamental difference within me. I carried something that no one else carried, a weight that didn't show on my face, but it showed in my exhaustion. I would occasionally see my sister at family events. Nothing explicit, nothing hostile. She would smile, talk, acting as if everything was under control, and perhaps at that moment she truly believed it was. But there was something different in the way she looked at me. It wasn't anger, it wasn't affection, it was vigilance, as if she were always trying to gauge, is he still on my side? Is he still silent? And that creates a strange distance, because you cease to be a sibling and become a variable. I noticed she avoided certain topics when I was around. She would change the subject. She would end conversations as if my presence were a silent risk. And that affected me more than I expected, because I hadn't done anything other than not lie. Even so, I was treated like someone dangerous. I began to understand something important. Silence, when it holds a truth too great, is not neutral. It begins to take shape. It begins to occupy space. It begins to influence everything around it. And even without saying a word, I was participating in something. I constantly asked myself, how long will this work? How long will she be able to sustain this alone? But I avoided going too far with these thoughts, because overthinking meant anticipating something I wasn't yet ready to face. My mother at times would comment, "She's been acting differently." I would nod in agreement, without explaining, because explaining would be crossing a line I hadn't yet crossed. And perhaps deep down, I was still trying to protect her, not from the truth but from its immediate impact. But there's a huge difference between protecting someone and hiding behind silence. And little by little, I began to feel that difference. I slept poorly, not out of guilt, that was important, but out of tension, because I knew that situation wasn't stable. It was just suspended, like something you hold in the air with your arm outstretched, knowing that at some point it will fall. And the more time passed, the more I felt that that silence wasn't protecting me. It was trapping me. I was no longer just the excluded brother at the wedding. Now I was the man who knew too much. And that changes everything. Because when you know the truth and choose not to speak, you begin to realize that silence also takes its toll, and it takes its toll in silent daily installments. It was at that moment, still without noise, still without confrontation, that I understood something that scared me. It wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. At first, I thought I could handle it, that the silence would only be a short phase, an interval until things settled down on their own. But silence doesn't stay still. It expands. It starts small, almost comfortable, and then it occupies spaces you don't even realize you left open. I started feeling this in the simplest situations: a family conversation, a Sunday lunch, a casual comment that seemed harmless. "She's so happy, isn't she? Marriage has done her good. Now she just has to enjoy this new phase." I listened to everything and said nothing. But each of those phrases resonated with me differently, because I knew what nobody else knew. And when you know something like that, the world starts to sound false, even when nobody is lying on purpose. I realized that silence requires effort. It's not passivity. It's constant vigilance. You start measuring your words, controlling your expressions, stepping away from certain subjects before they get too far. I couldn't agree too much, nor disagree too much. I needed to appear neutral. And that's exhausting. It's exhausting because you stop being spontaneous. Everything becomes calculated. Everything becomes restraint. At times, I felt like simply leaving, not the family, but the situations, because being there, physically present and emotionally absent, was exhausting. My sister, on the other hand, seemed too comfortable. She talked about routine, about the future. She made plans, and the more she talked, the more I felt that something was out of place. There was no explicit guilt. There was no visible fear. There was control, as if she believed that, as long as everything was normal on the outside, nothing could crumble on the inside. But the body doesn't lie. I noticed small cracks, a quicker glance when someone mentioned dates, a sudden change of subject, an untimely silence. Things that only catch the attention of someone who is overly attentive. And I was overly attentive. Because silence makes you like that. Hyper-vigilant. I started sleeping worse. I would wake up in the middle of the night with circular thoughts, not thoughts of exposure, but of anticipation. What if someone notices? What if they ask me directly? What do I do if they put this in my hands? I had no answers, because I still believed I could push it aside with time. But time, unlike what many people think, doesn't solve secrets. It only increases their price. And I started to feel that price being exacted on me. I was more irritable, less patient, not with other people, but with myself. Because I didn't like the position I'd been put in. I didn't like knowing something that couldn't be said. I didn't like being part of something I didn't choose. And, little by little, a question began to arise more frequently within me. Until when is this silence still a choice? And when does it become an omission? This question bothered me, because it didn't have a simple answer. I wasn't lying yet, but I wasn't being honest either. I was in the middle, and staying in the middle for too long is a dangerous place. At one of these family gatherings, someone made a silly joke. Nothing cruel, nothing offensive, but the joke touched exactly on a sensitive point, and I saw my sister freeze for half a second, only half a second, but I saw it. And in that instant, I understood something that changed my perception. She wasn't at peace. She was on alert. Her control wasn't tranquility. It was disguised tension. And that made me realize that the silence wasn't protecting anyone. It was only delaying the impact. And the longer it lasted, the greater the fall would be. I began to feel like I was holding something too heavy alone. And the worst part wasn't the weight. It was its loneliness. Because nobody knew, nobody asked, nobody could help. And I couldn't share. At that moment, it became clear to me that the silence had ceased to be neutral. It was already causing damage, still invisible, but real. And it was there, in the midst of that silent pressure, that I perceived the first sign that it wouldn't remain contained for much longer. Not because I would speak, but because the truth, when it starts to weigh too heavily, always looks for a way out. I noticed it before the others, not because I was smarter, but because I knew where to look. When you know the truth, you learn to recognize the small signs, those that go unnoticed by those who still believe in the surface of things. At first, they were almost invisible details. Dates that didn't match, stories told in slightly different ways, answers too quickly to simple questions. Nothing that, in isolation, stood out. But when you put it all together, it starts to make noise. I was present in a conversation where someone asked something banal, nothing invasive, nothing malicious. My sister answered, and then immediately corrected herself. A minimal correction, but I saw her husband frown. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but that's when I understood. He had also begun to notice. Not the whole truth, not yet, but the inconsistency. And inconsistency is the beginning of the end of any lie. After that, the signs began to repeat themselves. She became more defensive with simple questions. She overjustified what didn't need explaining before. And the most curious thing is that no one was attacking. The questions came from the most commonplace possible, everyday curiosity. But when someone lives maintaining something fragile, Even curiosity sounds like a threat. I started being put in uncomfortable situations. Nothing direct, but conversations where my presence seemed to demand silent confirmation. Someone would say something looking at me as if expecting me to add to it, or agree, or deny it, and I did none of that. I just remained silent. And for the first time, my silence began to bother other people, because too much silence also draws attention. I realized this when someone commented, "You've been quiet lately." I smiled. I looked away. But inside, I felt an alarm going off. Not because I was about to speak, but because the story no longer held up on its own. It needed constant maintenance. And the more maintenance a lie requires, the closer it is to failing. My sister started avoiding me a little more. Not completely, but enough to reduce the risk. Shorter conversations, fewer group meetings. She didn't want me around when certain topics came up. And this made something important clear to me. She no longer trusted silence. She needed total control. And total control doesn't exist in stories involving many people. I observed everything with a strange calm. Not the calm of someone who is comfortable, but of someone who knows that something inevitable is approaching. I didn't enjoy watching it happen. Quite the opposite. Each crack brought me a new weight because deep down I knew when it all crumbled it wouldn't be light. No one would emerge unscathed. But there was no way to stop it either. The lie had already begun to show its structural flaws, and I began to understand that my role in that story was changing. Before, I was the guardian of silence. Now, I was becoming the point of reference for truth, even without saying a word. And that's dangerous, because when people realize you know something, they start observing you differently. They start measuring your gestures, your tone of voice, your silence. I felt it. Longer gazes, strange pauses after certain sentences, as if, on some level, someone was already trying to confirm a suspicion. It was at that moment that I accepted something I had been trying to avoid. It was no longer under anyone's control. Not hers, not mine. The story had a life of its own now, and it was beginning to demand coherence. I still didn't know how, or when, but I knew that the first cracks were already visible. And when a structure begins to crack, it's only a matter of time before someone hears the snap. I didn't need to say anything to realize something had changed. People started observing me differently, not with open distrust, but with restrained curiosity. That curiosity that doesn't ask, but tries to understand. I felt it in the intervals between conversations, in the pauses that were too long, in the glances that lingered a second longer than normal. My silence was no longer neutral. It had begun to occupy space, and when silence occupies space, it becomes a message. My sister noticed this before everyone else. I saw it in the way she began to control the atmosphere when I was around. If I arrived, she changed the subject. If someone brought up a more sensitive topic, she ended the conversation. Not rudely, skillfully, it was almost automatic, But the more she tried to control, the more evident it became that there was something to be controlled. I began to understand something uncomfortable. My silence was no longer protecting her. It was exposing the fragility of the story. Because if nothing were wrong, there would be no need for so much care. I realized this clearly in a specific encounter. Nothing dramatic. Nothing planned. Someone asked a simple question, one of those that arise naturally. Before my sister could answer, she looked at me. It was quick, but it was clear. She wasn't seeking support. She was assessing risk. And that look changed everything within me. Because in that instant, I ceased to be a brother. I became a silent threat, not because I wanted to, but because I knew. And when someone knows too much, their mere presence is enough to be unsettling. I began to feel the weight of it, not as fear, but as responsibility, because I understood that if that story came to light in a disordered way, the impact would be much greater. And paradoxically, it was precisely the effort to avoid this that was accelerating the process. The silence was becoming too loud. I felt it even within myself. Every time I avoided a subject, something inside me withdrew. Every time I pretended not to notice an inconsistency, I distanced myself a little further from who I was. I wasn't lying, but I also wasn't being whole, and that begins to take an internal toll. My sister, on the other hand, seemed increasingly tense, not openly, but in her body, in her rigid shoulders, in her short breath, in the constant need to anticipate scenarios. She wasn't living, she was managing risks, managing perceptions, managing her own fear, and I realized that this wasn't sustainable. No one can live in a state of constant vigilance. At some point, something slips out. A word out of place, a gesture, a small detail, and I began to feel that this moment was approaching. What scared me most wasn't the truth appearing. It was how it would appear. Because when the truth emerges under pressure, it doesn't come gently. It comes breaking things. And I didn't want it to be like that. But I also couldn't continue being just the guardian of a silence that was already screaming. It was at this point that I accepted something I had been resisting. My silence was no longer an individual choice. It had become an active part of the story. And when you realize that your omission is shaping the course of things, you understand that at some point you will need to act, not on impulse, not for revenge, but out of responsibility. I still didn't know how, I still didn't know when, but I knew clearly enough to keep me awake at night. The silence was reaching its limit, and when that happens, either you find a conscious way to break it, or it breaks on its own. And when it breaks on its own, no one controls the damage. She contacted me again in a different way. It wasn't abrupt, it wasn't desperate, it was calculated. A short message, too polite for someone who'd known me forever. "Can we talk? Just the two of us." I already knew what that meant. It wasn't an invitation. It was a request disguised as a conversation. We met in a neutral place, away from family, away from curious eyes. She seemed more tired than the last time, not downcast. Tired. Like someone who'd spent too much time trying to keep something standing alone. She started talking about small things, routine, work, future plans. I let her. Because sometimes people need to build up their courage before getting to the real issue. When she finally got to the point, it wasn't like before. There was no grand request, no absurd proposal. It was something worse. It was something too small. "I just need you to avoid certain topics. Confirm some things if asked. Don't complicate things." She said it as if she were talking about a simple favor, as if she were asking me to change a schedule or keep a key safe. And that's when I realized how far the situation had gone. Before, she wanted me to uphold the entire lie. Now, she wanted me to help keep it alive little by little, drip by little. I was silent for a few seconds. She continued, "It's not lying. It's just not contradicting. You've always been good at that." That last sentence hurt more than I expected, because she was turning years of care and loyalty into skill at covering up. I answered calmly, "I won't do that." She tried to downplay it. "It's nothing serious. It's just until things get sorted out." And that's when I realized something that chilled me to the bone. For her, it would never sort itself out. There would always be another adjustment, another precaution, another omission. Lies aren't resolved, they're managed, and constant management requires constant accomplices. I made that clear. If I do this now, I'll have to do it forever. She looked away because she knew it was true. She tried another approach. She talked about family, about exposure, about consequences. She talked about how much could have been avoided if I cooperated just a little. But there was no more just a little. The silence had already crossed the line. I felt something different at that moment. Not anger, no pity, clarity. I understood that for her I was no longer a brother in that context. I was a pawn, and pawns don't have a choice. They just work or get in the way. I said something that changed the tone of the conversation. "Do you realize you're asking me to be someone I'm not?" She answered too quickly. "You've always been like this." And I took a deep breath before answering. "No, I've always been honest, and I'm being honest now. The silence that followed was heavy. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She was tense, like someone who realizes they're losing control. "So you're going to let everything fall apart?" she asked. The question came loaded with guilt. I answered without raising my voice. "I'm not tearing anything down. I'm just refusing to hold on to something that's already falling apart." She didn't insist anymore, but I left that meeting with an uneasy certainty. She wouldn't give up easily, because when someone builds their life on a fragile story, anyone who refuses to support that story becomes a threat. And at that moment, it became clear to me. The pressure hadn't ended. It had only changed form. And somewhere ahead, it would still put me at the center of everything, whether I wanted to or not. After that conversation, I felt something change in the air. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't visible, but it was as if the story had entered a countdown. I was no longer in control of the silence. Neither was she. The truth had begun to move on its own. I noticed it in the little things, in comments that came with too much caution, in questions that seemed casual but carried real curiosity. People started connecting the dots, not because someone was investigating, but because poorly supported stories end up revealing themselves. My sister was becoming increasingly rigid, less spontaneous, less present. She avoided long meetings. She left earlier. She responded less, not out of indifference, out of exhaustion. She was tired of managing something that wouldn't stop demanding attention. And the more tired someone gets, the more flaws appear. I noticed a specific moment when everything seemed to become more fragile. It was a simple conversation, one of those that arise unintentionally. Someone commented on deadlines, about time, about future plans, nothing out of the ordinary, but I saw the reaction. A microsecond delay in the response, a look seeking confirmation where it shouldn't exist. And I realized it wasn't just me who saw it anymore. Her husband was paying attention now, not suspicious in the classic sense, but attentive, like someone who senses that something doesn't fit, even without knowing exactly what. And that changes everything. Because when the closest person starts to feel inconsistency, no silence can hold it together. I started being placed in increasingly delicate situations, indirect questions, conversations in low tones, nothing explicit. But there was an expectation in the air. It was as if, on some level, people felt I was a key point, not because I talked too much, but because I talked too little. And that creates curiosity, creates suspicion, creates discomfort. I realized that from that moment on, remaining silent was no longer just a neutral gesture. It was interpreted. Every pause I made was read. Every digression was noticed. And I began to understand that even without saying a word, I was participating in the revelation, not by action, but by contrast. Because when a story is fragile, any firm behavior around it becomes a threat. My sister became even more withdrawn, and this had a dangerous side effect. People started talking amongst themselves, not direct gossip, but assumptions. And assumptions are the worst kind of noise, because they grow uncontrollably. I found myself thinking about something I had avoided until then. Perhaps the greatest damage wasn't the truth itself, but the way it was about to emerge. Without context, without preparation, without care. I didn't want to be the trigger, but I also didn't want to be complicit in a silent implosion. And that's when something became clear to me. The silence was no longer postponing the problem, it was fueling the chaos. And when chaos grows in silence, it explodes in a disorderly way. I began to mentally prepare myself for what was to come, not to speak, but to endure. Because at some point someone would ask directly, not aggressively, but honestly. And when that happened, I would need to choose between continuing to hide behind silence or calmly and firmly accepting what I already knew. I didn't know when that moment would come, but I knew with enough certainty to make my chest clench. He was near. And when he arrived, there would be no comfortable answer. The moment didn't come as a shock. It came as confirmation. There were no shouts. There was no direct accusation. It was a conversation too simple for something that carried so much weight. I was with him, alone. Nothing planned, nothing rehearsed. He mentioned something banal first, work routine. Then he remained silent for a few seconds longer than usual, and then he asked, looking directly at me, "Do you think everything is all right?" The question wasn't laden with open distrust. It was laden with honest doubt, and that's much harder to deal with, because when someone accuses you, you defend yourself. When someone asks sincerely, you have to choose who you are, I answered carefully. I think things are more fragile than they seem. He wasn't scared. He nodded slowly, as if he had thought about it before. He took a deep breath and said something that put me exactly where I didn't want to be. I feel like you know something I don't. At that moment, everything became clear. There was no more room for neutrality. My silence had been interpreted, and in a way, he was right. I didn't respond immediately, not strategically, but because I needed to align something within myself. I didn't want to hurt him, but I also couldn't lie. And that's when I realized the true weight of the situation. Anything I said or didn't say would change lives. I chose the only response that still preserved my integrity. I know things that aren't mine to tell. But I also know that pretending to be normal isn't helping anyone. He remained silent, not out of anger, processing. Then he asked in a low voice, "Are you saying something's wrong?" I didn't look away. I'm saying something doesn't fit, and that continuing to pretend it does will hurt more people. He closed his eyes for a moment, and in that simple gesture, I saw everything. Confusion, fear, preparation. He didn't insist on details, but he said something that marked that moment as irreversible. If you were in my place, when would you want to know? That question hung between us, because it wasn't about facts. It was about character. I answered with complete honesty, yes. And that's when I understood that the silence was over, not because I decided to speak at that moment, but because someone had asked for the truth in the right way, without pressure, without spectacle, with dignity. We ended the conversation without another word. There was no agreement. There was no promise. But there was something new in the air. Conscience. And when conscience enters the scene, the lie loses its place. I left there knowing that my position had changed. I was no longer just the man who knew too much. I had become the point of intersection, the place where truth and denial met, and that is a lonely place. Because from then on, any decision would carry weight. Any step would be definitive. I knew that the next move wouldn't depend only on me, but I also knew something important. Staying silent now would no longer be neutrality. It would be a choice. And when silence becomes a conscious choice, it transforms into a lie. After that conversation, I could no longer pretend that everything was the same. Something had changed inside me, not because I had decided to speak, but because I had understood that remaining silent now had a different meaning. Before, silence was a boundary, a way of not getting involved. Now it was beginning to resemble consent, and that difference is subtle, but devastating. I began to review each recent moment from another perspective. Every time I avoided a subject, every time I pretended not to notice an inconsistency, every time I let someone believe something I knew wasn't true, I wasn't lying with words, but I was allowing the lie to breathe. And that began to corrode me. Not like explosive guilt, but like continuous discomfort, a weight that doesn't scream, but doesn't leave you in peace. I thought about her husband, not as an antagonist, but as someone who trusted, and trust is too fragile to be treated as a collateral detail. I asked myself something I had avoided until then. If all this explodes the wrong way, what will my role be in that explosion? I didn't want to be responsible for the chaos, but I also didn't want to be remembered as someone who saw everything happen and chose not to act. That kind of memory doesn't fade. It stays. I tried to talk to myself honestly, not with pretty phrases, but with hard truths. I owed no loyalty to lies. I owed loyalty to my conscience. And that didn't mean shouting the truth. It meant stopping protecting what could no longer be protected. I realized my sister had crossed a point of no return. She was no longer trying to avoid pain. She was trying to avoid consequences, and that changes everything. Avoiding pain can be human. Avoiding consequences, that's another thing. I began to understand that silence, at that stage, was no longer neutral. It had already chosen a side, and it wasn't the side I wanted to be on. That night I barely slept, not out of anxiety, but by decision, because I knew that soon someone would ask me again. Maybe not in the same way, maybe not with the same words, but the question would come, and when it came, I could no longer answer evasively. I could no longer hide behind, "That's none of my business." Because when you know someone is being deceived, that becomes your business. I didn't plan a speech, I didn't rehearse phrases. I only decided one thing. When the truth demanded its due, I wouldn't be the obstacle. And that in itself was already a rupture. I wasn't choosing to destroy anyone. I was choosing not to destroy myself. And that silent decision changed everything. Because from then on, the next step wouldn't be mine. But when it came, I would be ready not to lie, not to others, nor to myself. The conversation happened days later. It wasn't planned as a confrontation. There was no formal meeting. There was no audience. It was simple, and perhaps that's why it was so devastating. He contacted me again, not with demands, not with accusations, with weariness. There was something different in his gaze now. It wasn't just doubt, it was preparation. Like someone who already knows something isn't right and just needs confirmation. We sat down, without haste. He spoke first. He said he felt he was living inside an incomplete story, that the pieces didn't fit, even when everything seemed normal. I listened. I didn't interrupt, because that moment wasn't about me. When he finished, he was silent, and then he said something that took away any possibility of escape. I need to know if I'm imagining things, or if there's something I'm not seeing. The question wasn't filled with anger. It was filled with dignity. And that's when I understood. If I stayed silent now, I would be choosing to lie. I took a deep breath, not to gather courage, but to remain calm. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't dramatize. I only said what needed to be said. You're not imagining things. He closed his eyes for a moment, then he opened them. Then something is wrong. I nodded. I didn't give details. I didn't expose anyone. I didn't tell the whole story, but I also didn't deny reality. There's a truth that isn't being told, and continuing to pretend it doesn't exist will hurt even more. He stood still, processing. I didn't try to soften the blow. I didn't attack either. I simply let the truth take its place. And that was enough. Because when someone already suspects, an honest confirmation weighs more than 1,000 explanations. He thanked me. Not with grand words, he simply said, "Thank you for not lying to me." And that stayed with me, because that phrase showed me something important. Telling the truth doesn't destroy. Lying is what destroys little by little. We ended the conversation without an immediate resolution. There was no explosion. There was no accusation at that moment. But something had definitively changed. The false story had lost its foundation. And from then on, there was no going back to normal. I knew the consequences would come, not all at once, but in waves. And I accepted that because at that moment, I knew I had done the only thing possible. I had stopped protecting the silence and let the truth exist, without anger, without spectacle, but whole. After that day, nothing was ever the same again. And not because there were shouts, fights, or dramatic scenes, but because the truth, once acknowledged, changes the way everything is seen. I returned to my routine, but I felt that something had been displaced within the family. Conversations became shorter. Looks began to carry more meaning. The normal lost its naturalness. There were no open accusations, but there was distance, and distance, when it arises after the truth, is not empty. It is heavy. My sister didn't contact me, and that didn't surprise me, because for the first time I was no longer useful for supporting anything. I was no longer the convenient silence. I had made it clear, without raising my voice, which side I was on. Not against her, but in favor of reality. I thought a lot about whether I had done the right thing, not because I doubted the decision, but because even the right decisions hurt. They just hurt in the necessary way. I lost something in that story. I lost the version of my sister that I knew. I lost the illusion that family love always finds an easy way. But I gained something I didn't have before: peace with who I am. I could sleep. I could look at myself in the mirror. And that matters more than it seems, until the day you lose it. What marked me most wasn't what was said. It was what hadn't happened yet, because the truth had been acknowledged, but hadn't yet been fully confronted. It was there, now visible, but still without public consequences, without final decisions. And that left me with an uncomfortable certainty. The story wasn't over yet. It had only changed phases. Because when a hidden truth comes to light, it doesn't solve everything at once. It starts to take its toll. And it takes its toll on those who tried to hide it, and also on those who tried to support it. I know the real impact is yet to come. I know there will be conversations that haven't happened yet, decisions that haven't been made yet, wounds that haven't been opened yet, but that will need to be. And when that happens, no one will be able to pretend everything is normal again. Not her. Not him. Not me. The silence is over, but the price of the truth is still being calculated. I thought telling the truth would be the hardest part, but I was wrong. The hardest part was yet to come, when everyone had to decide what to do with her.